June 1941. Without warning, millions of soldiers began marching east into the unknown. The world watched as one of history's most dangerous gambles unfolded, a war driven by ideology, ambition, fear, and deadly overconfidence. But what really pushed Hitler to attack the Soviet Union, a nation so vast it could swallow entire armies, was its strategy, desperation, or a fatal illusion of unstoppable power? In this documentary, you'll uncover the hidden motives, shocking decisions, and human stories behind the invasion that changed World War II forever. Stay with me, because the truth behind this decision is far more terrifying and far more human than you've ever heard before. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. The summer of 1941 began like any other across the vast plains of Eastern Europe. Fields of wheat swayed gently, villages carried on with quiet routines, and millions of people believed that despite the tension in Europe, a fragile peace still held. Yet behind closed doors in Berlin, a decision had already been made, a decision that would ignite one of the most devastating chapters in human history. The man at the center of it all was Adolf Hitler, leader of Nazi Germany, a figure driven not only by military ambition, but by ideology, obsession, and a dangerous belief in destiny. His target was the vast and formidable Soviet Union, ruled by Joseph Stalin, a nation he both feared and despised. But why did Hitler launch this invasion? The answer is not simple. It is a story of hatred, miscalculation, resources, and an ambition so vast that it would ultimately consume millions of lives and destroy the very empire he hoped to build. Section 1 to Ideology. A war of belief. For Hitler, war against the Soviet Union was not merely strategic, it was ideological. He viewed communism as an existential enemy, something he believed threatened the survival of his vision for Europe. In his worldview, the Soviet state represented everything he despised: political opposition, cultural difference, and a rival system challenging his vision of power. This hatred was deeply personal. He saw the coming war as a clash of civilizations, a brutal confrontation that he believed was inevitable. To him, conquering the Soviet lands would prove the superiority of his ideology. To the people living there, however, it meant terror descending from the sky. Bombers, artillery, and soldiers marching into their towns with ruthless efficiency. DOM of Ford, that M of expansion. To Lebensraum, the dream of expansion. Another powerful motivation was territory. The concept of living space. Hitler believed Germany needed vast lands to feed its population and fuel its future. The fertile plains of Eastern Europe seemed like a prize waiting to be seized. In his mind, these lands were not just strategic, they were destiny. Farms would supply German cities. Industries would power an unstoppable war machine, and entire regions would be reshaped under his rule. But beneath this vision lay unimaginable human cost. Millions of civilians, farmers, workers, children were suddenly caught in a storm not of their making. Their homes became battlefields. Their lives became statistics in a war of conquest. Section 3, Fear and Preemptive War. Despite the pact that had temporarily kept peace between the two regimes, distrust simmered beneath the surface. Hitler feared that Stalin's growing military might could eventually threaten Germany. He convinced himself that striking first was the only way to survive. Whether real or exaggerated became fuel for aggression. Plans were drawn up in secrecy. Troops gathered along the border. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht prepared for what they were told would be a swift, decisive campaign. One that would end before winter arrived. Many soldiers believed they were marching toward glory. Few understood that they were stepping into one of the deadliest struggles in history. Mara, gold cram of ambition, oil, grain, and survival. War consumes resources, oil for tanks, grain for soldiers, steel for weapons. Germany's economy was under pressure, and Hitler saw the Soviet territories as the answer to every shortage. The oil fields, the factories, and the massive agricultural lands promised independence from economic limitations. Control over these resources would allow Germany to fight longer and harder than its enemies. But what looked like opportunity on maps became devastation on the ground. Cities burned, infrastructure collapsed, civilians faced starvation and displacement. The invasion was not just a military campaign, it was an economic gamble paid for in human suffering. Two forces were racing toward an inevitable collision, but perhaps the most dangerous reason for the invasion was simple: overconfidence. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. Early victories elsewhere had convinced him that his army was unstoppable. As German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory, the reality proved far different. The land was vast, the resistance fierce, and the weather merciless. The march toward Moscow became a nightmare of frozen roads, exhausted soldiers, and mounting casualties. The invasion that was supposed to secure victory instead stretched German forces thin, opening new fronts and draining resources. It was the turning point that began to unravel Hitler's empire. Closing reflection on human cost. In the end, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union because of a dangerous mix of ideology, ambition, fear, and miscalculation. He believed he was shaping history, but instead he unleashed a conflict that devastated entire nations. The invasion reshaped the course of the war and left scars that would last generations. Families were torn apart. Cities were reduced to ruins. Millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives in a struggle driven by one man's vision of conquest. History reminds us that wars are not only decided by generals or strategies, they are lived by ordinary people. Farmers who lost their land, mothers who lost their children, soldiers who marched into battle, believing in promises that would never be fulfilled. And as we look back today, the question is not only why Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, but how humanity can learn from the tragedy, so that ambition and hatred never again lead the world into such darkness. For Adolf Hitler, the war against the Soviet Union was never simply about borders or military positioning. It was born from an ideological worldview that had taken shape years before tanks ever rolled eastward. He believed history was a permanent struggle between political systems and cultures, and in his mind, communism represented a dangerous force that threatened everything he imagined Germany should become. Long before generals discussed strategy, he had already framed the conflict as a battle for survival, portraying the coming invasion as a crusade rather than a conventional war. This belief filtered through speeches, propaganda, and the minds of soldiers who were told they were participating in a historic mission against an enemy that was portrayed not only as political opposition but as a symbol of chaos and decay. The roots of this ideological hostility stretched back to the turbulent years after the First World War, when Europe was filled with fear of revolution and economic collapse. Hitler watched the spread of communist movements across parts of the continent and convinced himself that Germany had narrowly escaped a similar fate. To him, the Soviet system was not just another government. It was proof of what he considered a destructive ideology gaining ground. His experiences in post-war Germany reinforced a belief that communism was responsible for national humiliation and instability. Over time, this perception hardened into a fixed narrative in which Germany's future prosperity depended on the destruction of that system. Inside Nazi political doctrine, anti-communism became central to identity and policy. Propaganda portrayed the Soviet Union as a relentless enemy, plotting to expand westward and undermine European civilization. Posters, speeches, and state-controlled media repeated the idea that a final confrontation was inevitable. Many German citizens, already scarred by economic crisis and political violence, were receptive to such messages. Fear and resentment blended into a powerful emotional force that made the idea of war seem not only acceptable but necessary. By the late 1930s, ideological hostility had become so deeply embedded that diplomacy felt temporary and fragile, a pause rather than a lasting peace. When German and Soviet leaders signed a non-aggression pact, it was seen by some as a shocking reversal of hostility. Yet within Hitler's inner circle, the agreement was understood as a strategic delay rather than genuine cooperation. He continued to describe the Soviet state as an ideological enemy that had to be confronted eventually. Military planning began almost immediately after early successes in Western Europe, driven by a conviction that ideological warfare demanded total victory rather than coexistence. Officers were briefed not only on battlefield tactics but on the ideological purpose of their mission, reinforcing the idea that they were part of a historic struggle rather than a limited campaign. The ideological dimension shaped how the invasion was planned and executed. Soldiers were encouraged to see themselves as agents of a transformative mission. Tasked with dismantling what they had been told was an illegitimate and dangerous system. This framing influenced policies that treated the conflict as fundamentally different from previous wars, erasing many traditional restraints and encouraging extreme brutality. Civilians were not viewed as neutral populations, but as participants in an ideological enemy, a perspective that fueled widespread violence and suffering across occupied territories. Within the German military command, not everyone fully embraced the ideological fervor, yet many found themselves operating within a framework established by political leadership. Orders reflected a worldview in which the war was not merely against an army, but against an entire political culture. Training materials emphasized the need for harsh measures, and some officers internalized these beliefs while others followed directives out of loyalty or fear of dissent. The ideological narrative created an atmosphere where extreme actions were rationalized as necessary steps toward a larger historical goal. The ideological war also shaped the expected ions of German leadership. Hitler believed that many Soviet citizens would welcome German forces as liberators from communist rule. This assumption revealed how deeply ideology influenced strategic thinking, leading to miscalculations about resistance and morale. Instead of a swift collapse, the invasion encountered fierce opposition, fueled by patriotism and the determination to defend homeland and families. The ideological framing blinded planners to the complexity of Soviet society and the resilience of its people. On the Soviet side, the invasion confirmed fears of foreign aggression and mobilized a powerful response. Propaganda emphasized defense of the motherland against an ideological enemy bent on destruction. Soldiers and civilians alike were called to resist not only an invading army, but a worldview that threatened their existence. The ideological clash intensified the brutality on both sides, turning the Eastern Front into one of the most violent theaters of war ever witnessed. As German forces advanced, the ideological mission continued to influence decision-making. Policies toward prisoners of war and civilians reflected a belief that the conflict was existential rather than conventional. Entire communities were uprooted, and vast regions experienced devastation fueled by a war that had been framed as a struggle between incompatible systems. The ideological lens made compromise impossible. Victory was imagined only as total domination. Even as logistical problems mounted and resistance stiffened, Hitler clung to his ideological convictions. He interpreted setbacks not as signs of strategic error, but as proof that the enemy was dangerous and had to be crushed with even greater determination. His speeches emphasized destiny and historical inevitability, ray high, endorsing the narrative that the war was essential for Germany's future. Generals who suggested caution often found their concerns dismissed because ideology overpowered pragmatic analysis. The invasion demonstrated how belief systems can transform political rivalry into apocalyptic struggle. Soldiers on the ground witnessed the consequences of orders shaped by ideological hatred, while civilians endured the collapse of normal life as armies clashed across their towns and countryside. The war's brutality was inseparable from the worldview that had justified it from the beginning. As months passed, the ideological war intensified, pushing both sides into deeper cycles of violence and retaliation, each convinced that survival depended on defeating an enemy defined not just by borders but by identity and belief. Entire units marching through villages under banners proclaiming a crusade against an idea rather than a nation. Commanders reading political directives. Alongside battle maps, recruits absorbing lessons that framed the conflict as a defining moment for the future of Europe. Conversations in barracks shaped by propaganda and fear. Columns of soldiers advancing with a sense that they were participating in a historic transformation that would reshape continents and generations, convinced that their actions were part of an unstoppable movement that had been building for years within speeches, rallies, and ideological manifestos that painted the Eastern Campaign as unavoidable and sacred, leaving little room for doubt or hesitation as the march continued deeper into territories defined in their minds by ideology, rather than the lives unfolding within them. Fields stretching endlessly ahead, while political officers repeated narratives of destiny and struggle. Young recruits carrying both rifles and convictions forged by years of relentless messaging, trains unloading divisions at the frontier while commanders reminded them that this was not just another front but the ultimate test of belief and power. The rumble of engines echoing across plains where ideology and reality were about to collide in ways few could fully imagine. Each step forward reinforcing a vision shaped long before the first shot was fired. Soldiers writing letters home describing a mission portrayed as historic and necessary. Unnecessary. Columns disappearing into the horizon beneath banners that framed the invasion as the opening act of a vast ideological confrontation still unfolding across endless distances and uncertain futures where conviction drove momentum more powerfully than caution or doubt as the campaign pressed onward into landscapes vast enough to swallow armies and reshape destinies without pause or reflection. The concept of territorial expansion, often described through the German term Lebensraum, was central to the worldview of Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler, shaping both ideology and military strategy long before the invasion of the Soviet Union began. He imagined a vast Eastern Empire that would transform Germany into a self-sufficient superpower, fueled by fertile farmland, abundant resources, and a restructured population that would serve the ambitions of Nazi Germany. To him, expansion eastward was not simply conquest, but a vision of national rebirth, a plan to reshape geography and demographics to create what he believed would be a permanent foundation for German dominance. Maps were studied not only for military routes, but for agricultural potential rail networks and areas that could be reorganized to support a growing population. The Eastern Territories appeared as endless fields and open spaces that could be turned into colonies supplying grain, livestock, and industrial output for decades to come. In Hitler's speeches and writings, the idea of living space was framed as a necessity rather than a choice. Germany, he claimed, faced limitations within its existing borders, and expansion was portrayed as the only way to secure food security and economic independence. The trauma of shortages during previous conflicts influenced this thinking, creating a fear that without new land, Germany would remain vulnerable to blockade and starvation. Supporters of the regime repeated these arguments, presenting the East as an opportunity waiting to be claimed. Military planners were encouraged to view territory as a strategic resource equal to weapons or manpower. Agricultural experts and bureaucrats drafted detailed proposals outlining how conquered land would be reorganized into farms operated for the benefit of the German state. Propaganda transformed the abstract idea of expansion into a powerful emotional narrative. Posters depicted vast golden fields stretching toward the horizon, promising prosperity and stability for future generations. Citizens were told that the eastern lands were historically connected to German destiny, reinforcing a sense that conquest would simply restore a natural order. Schools taught young people that expansion was a path toward greatness, blending nationalism with visions of rural abundance. This messaging shaped public opinion, making the invasion appear as a bold step toward a prosperous future, rather than an act of aggression that would devastate millions of lives. Within military planning, Lebensraum translated into concrete objectives. Commanders were instructed to capture key agricultural regions, seize transport hubs, and secure industrial centers that could support long-term occupation. Engineers prepared plans for new settlements and infrastructure designed to integrate conquered territories into the German economic system. Administrators envisioned entire regions being reorganized to prioritize German settlers, with local populations displaced or forced into labor. The invasion was therefore not only a military campaign, but a project of colonization that aimed to permanently transform Eastern Europe's landscape and society. As troops crossed borders, they encountered villages and cities filled with people who had their own histories, cultures, and aspirations. Yet the ideological framework of living space encouraged soldiers and officials to see the land primarily as a resource rather than a home to millions. This perspective influenced policies that stripped communities of property and rights, often with brutal efficiency. Farms were seized, harvests requisitioned, and infrastructure reputed, froze to serve the needs of the occupying forces. Civilians found themselves caught in a sweeping plan that treated geography as an asset and human lives as obstacles to be managed or removed. The quest for Lebensraum also shaped expectations about the future of Germany itself. Leaders imagined a new society rooted in agriculture and expansion, where German families would settle in newly conquered regions and create thriving communities aligned with the regime's vision. Recruitment campaigns encouraged settlers to consider moving east once victory was achieved. Architects drafted designs for model towns and transportation networks that would link the new territories to the German heartland. The invasion was framed as the beginning of a generational transformation that would secure prosperity and stability far beyond the immediate war. However, the reality of conquest proved far more complex and brutal than the propaganda suggested. The vastness of the land posed logistical challenges that strained supply lines and communication networks. Resistance from local populations and organized military forces disrupted plans for rapid settlement and economic exploitation. The destruction caused by combat made agricultural production difficult, undermining the promise of abundant resources. Soldiers found themselves fighting in unfamiliar terrain, facing harsh weather and determined opposition, while administrators struggled to implement policies designed in distant offices. The ideology of living space also influenced the behavior of occupying forces, encouraging extreme measures to achieve rapid control. Entire communities were uprooted as authorities attempted to clear land for future German use. Food supplies were diverted to support the invading army, contributing to spread hunger among civilians. The campaign's brutality was intensified by the belief that expansion justified harsh actions, leading to widespread suffering that extended far beyond the battlefield. Reports from the front revealed a landscape transformed by violence, with burned villages, empty farms, and displaced families. moving across devastated countryside. Despite mounting difficulties, Hitler remained committed to the vision of Eastern expansion. He saw setbacks, not as evidence that the concept was flawed, but as temporary obstacles to a grand historical mission. Military objectives continued to prioritize territory, even when strategic circumstances might have suggested consolidation or retreat. Generals faced pressure to advance deeper into hostile territory to secure the land promised in ideological plans. The insistence on capturing vast regions stretched resources thin and contributed to the long-term exhaustion of German forces. For soldiers, the idea of Lebensraum became part of daily life on the Eastern Front. Political officers and propaganda units reminded them that every village captured was a step toward a new future for Germany. Letters home often echoed this language, describing the immense landscapes and the belief that they were participating in a transformative campaign. Yet the contrast between propaganda and reality grew sharper as casualties mounted, and the harshness of the front became impossible to ignore. What had been portrayed as fertile paradise often appeared instead as a battlefield scarred by destruction and resistance. The pursuit of living space transformed the invasion into a war of occupation and colonization, intertwining military operations with ideological goals that reshape policy and behavior. Administrative units follow, de-advancing armies to implement plans for economic exploitation and demographic change. Trains carried confiscated goods westward, while new regulations governed the lives of civilians under occupation. The campaign blurred the line between war and social engineering, with entire regions treated as laboratories for a radical vision of expansion and control. Soldiers marching through fields that had been promised as the foundation of a new empire, commanders studying maps that divided territories into future settlements and resource zones, convoys transporting equipment intended not only for battle but for reconstruction. According to ideological plans, villages transformed into administrative centers overnight, local populations subjected to rules designed to reshape daily life and labor patterns, endless columns advancing across plains where propaganda had painted dreams of abundance. Political directives read aloud alongside operational orders, engineers surveying land for roads and railways, meant to bind conquered regions permanently to German industry, settlers waiting in anticipation of a future that planners insisted was inevitable, officers debating which regions would provide the greatest agricultural yield once resistance was crushed, trains unloading machinery for farms that existed only on paper while artillery echoed in the distance, soldiers gazing across vast horizons, described in speeches as the birthplace of a new era, yet marked by smoke and ruin. Administrative offices filling with reports detailing harvest quotas and labor assignments. Even as battles raged nearby, the march continuing through landscapes seen not as foreign countries, but as the raw material of an ideological dream that reshapes strategy, expectations, and daily decisions as the campaign used ever deeper into territory envisioned as the future heartland of an expanding empire, still defined by conquest and unrelenting movement forward economic ambition, and the relentless search for resources formed a powerful driving force behind the Eastern invasion conceived by Adolf Hitler and the leadership of Nazi Germany. Modern warfare demanded vast quantities of fuel, food, steel, and industrial capacity, and German planners believed that long-term victory required securing these assets through conquest rather than trade. The asterisk Soviet Union's Esterbied, on maps as a reservoir of oil fields, fertile farmland, coal deposits, and sprawling factories capable of sustaining a war machine for years. Economic experts working alongside military strategists calculated production potential and resource flows, envisioning a future where captured industries would supply German armies while agricultural output would prevent the shortages that had haunted earlier conflicts. Discussions in government offices increasingly framed the invasion as a solution to economic vulnerability, a way to transform scarcity into abundance through territorial expansion. Germany's early wartime successes masked deep structural weaknesses in its economy. Imports were limited by naval blockades and diplomatic tensions, while domestic production struggled to keep pace with the demands of mechanized warfare. Tanks required constant fuel, aircraft consumed massive amounts of aviation gasoline, and armies on the move depended on uninterrupted food supplies. Leaders feared that without new sources of raw materials, the momentum gained on battlefields in Western Europe would stall. The oil-rich regions of the Caucasus and the industrial zones scattered across Soviet territory seemed to promise and dependence from foreign markets. Economic planners imagined pipelines, railways, and shipping routes, redirecting energy and resources directly into German hands. Agriculture played an equally critical role in the economic rationale for invasion. Memories of starvation and rationing during previous wars remained vivid, shaping a belief that Germany could not survive a prolonged global conflict without controlling vast bread baskets. The fertile plains of Ukraine were often described as a treasure, capable of feeding both soldiers and civilians back home. Bureaucrats drafted elaborate food distribution schemes designed to prioritize German needs while diverting harvests from local populations. Grain shipments were calculated months before the invasion began, with expectations that new territories would rapidly produce surpluses to stabilize domestic markets. Soldiers were told that securing farmland was as vital as capturing strategic cities. Industrial capacity also captured the imagination of German planners. Soviet factories, mines, and rail hubs represented an opportunity to expand production, without the long delays required to build new facilities from scratch. Engineers studied blueprints and intelligence reports, mapping out how captured plants could be repurposed to manufacture weapons, vehicles, and equipment for German forces. The idea was to transform conquered industry into an extension of the German war economy, creating a self-sustaining system capable of outproducing any rival. Administrators prepared lists of machinery to be dismantled and transported westward, while military units were tasked with seizing key industrial regions intact whenever possible. The economic vision extended beyond immediate wartime needs into long-term planning for a German dominated Europe. Economists within the regime described a continental system where resources flowed toward Berlin, while conquered territories provided labor and raw materials. The invasion was framed as the foundation for a new economic order that would eliminate dependence on global trade networks controlled by potential enemies. Policies were drafted to integrate rail systems, standardize currencies, and reorganize local economies around German priorities. Maps depicting supply routes and production zones circulated among high-ranking officials, reinforcing the belief that victory would create an unprecedented level of economic power. When the invasion began, economic objectives shaped operational decisions. From the very first days, armored divisions raced toward oil fields, grain silos, and industrial centers with orders to capture infrastructure before retreating forces could destroy it. Logistics units followed closely behind, cataloging resources and coordinating shipments back to Germany. Trains loaded with raw materials began moving westward, even as fighting continued nearby. Occupation authorities established quotas for agricultural production and industrial output, attempting to transform chaotic war zones into functioning supply networks for the German military. However, the economic gamble encountered immediate obstacles. Retreating Soviet forces adopted scorched earth tactics, destroying factories, burning crops, and dismantling equipment to deny resources to the invaders. Vast distances and damaged infrastructure, complicated transportation, slowing the movement of goods and supplies. Resistance from local populations disrupted production, while harsh weather conditions hindered agricultural plans. Soldiers found themselves guarding fields and railways rather than engaging solely in combat, as the drive for resources required constant protection and supervision. The promise of abundant oil and grain became entangled with the reality of maintaining control over hostile territory. The economic logic behind the invasion also influenced policies towards civilians and prisoners of war. Labor shortages in Germany led to the forced recruitment of workers from occupied regions who were transported to factories and farms under harsh conditions. Food distribution systems prioritized German troops and the homeland, contributing to widespread hunger in conquered areas. Industrial equipment was dismantled and shipped westward, leaving local economies in ruins. The pursuit of resources blurred the line between military occupation and economic exploitation, intensifying the suffering experienced by millions caught in the path of advancing armies. Despite these challenges, German leadership continued to view economic conquest as essential. Reports from the front, highlighting production shortfalls and logistical failures, were often overshadowed by optimistic projections that promised future abundance once resistance was crushed. Hitler's speeches emphasized the importance of securing oil and grain, framing setbacks as temporary obstacles on the road to economic independence. Generals were pressured to advance toward resource-rich regions, even when military conditions were unfavorable, reinforcing the idea that the war's ultimate purpose was tied to economic transformation. For ordinary soldiers, the economic dimension of the invasion was visible in daily routines. Units guarded warehouses, supervised harvests, and escorted convoys carrying fuel and machinery. Engineers repaired railways to maintain supply lines, while administrators traced clad production quotas and shipment schedules. Letters home described landscapes filled with fields and factories that propaganda had promised would secure Germany's future. Yet the contrast between expectations and reality grew more apparent as supply shortages persisted and the cost of maintaining occupation increased. What had been envisioned as a swift economic triumph became a prolonged struggle to extract resources from a war-torn region. As the campaign pushed deeper into Soviet territory, economic objectives continued to shape strategy. Commanders debated whether to prioritize industrial centers or oil fields, while planners struggled to allocate limited transport capacity between military supplies and extracted resources. The need for fuel influenced the direction of offensives, with entire operations designed around capturing energy infrastructure. Administrative units established offices in occupied cities to manage production and labor, turning urban centers into hubs of economic control, even as fighting raged nearby. The relentless pursuit of resources transformed the Eastern Campaign into a vast economic experiment conducted amid constant warfare. Convoys rumbling along damaged roads carrying barrels of fuel and sacks of grain, while artillery thundered in the distance, engineers measuring factory floors to determine how quickly machines could be repurposed for German production. Clerks compiling endless reports on harvest yields and coal output, trains packed with confiscated equipment crossing borders toward the west, soldiers guarding oil depots that symbolized the promise of independence from foreign supplies, occupation officials negotiating with local administrators to restart mines and workshops under new management, farmers compelled to meet quotas that fed distant armies rather than their own communities, warehouses filling with raw materials destined for German industry, even as surrounding towns struggled with shortages, commanders studying maps dotted with symbols representing refineries and rail junctions, rather than defensive positions, columns advancing through regions chosen as much for their economic value as for strategic importance. Political officers reminding troops that every captured factory and field represented a step towards self-sufficiency. Administrators drafting regulations that reshaped local economies overnight. Convoys of trucks hauling machinery salvaged from dismantled plants, while refugees moved along the same roads in the opposite direction. Engineers racing to restore pipelines and power stations to keep the flow of resources uninterrupted. Soldiers assigned to protect harvests from sabotage as fiercely as they defended frontline positions. Entire divisions diverted to secure mining districts believed essential for future production. Planners in distant offices recalculating supply projections based on uncertain reports from occupied territories, the march continuing deeper into landscapes defined by the promise of oil, grain, and industrial power as economic ambition remained inseparable from the movement of armies and the relentless demand for resources that drove decisions across every level of command and occupation. Fear and suspicion played a decisive role in shaping the thinking of Adolf Hitler, as tensions grew between in Nazi Germany, Soviet Nazi Germany, Joseph Stalin, creating an atmosphere where preemptive war seemed to him not only justified but necessary. Although the two powers had signed a non-aggression pact, distrust lingered beneath diplomatic language, and both sides continued to prepare for a possible future conflict. German intelligence reports describe Soviet military expansion, new divisions forming, and industrial output increasing at a pace that alarmed German leadership. Hitler interpreted these developments as signs that the Soviet Union would eventually challenge Germany's dominance in Europe. He convinced himself that waiting would only allow a potential enemy to grow stronger, turning hesitation into vulnerability. Within his inner circle, conversations increasingly focused on the belief that the only way to secure Germany's future was to strike first before Soviet power reached its full potential. The fear of encirclement and long-term strategic isolation also influenced decision-making. Germany faced powerful adversaries in the West, and Hitler worried that a strengthened Soviet Union could eventually join forces with other enemies to crush his regime from multiple directions. The military advisors debated the possibility of a two-front war, a scenario deeply feared because of Germany's historical experiences. Hitler argued that eliminating the Soviet threat early would prevent such a disaster, allowing German forces to focus on other fronts without fear of a massive Eastern invasion. This logic framed the war not as reckless aggression, but as a necessary step to avoid future catastrophe. Planning documents emphasized speed and surprise, reflecting a desire to overwhelm Soviet defenses before they could fully mobilize. Propaganda reinforced the narrative of an imminent Soviet threat. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and speeches warned citizens that communism was expanding and preparing for war. Images of massive Soviet parades and industrial growth were used to create a sense of urgency, convincing we are Germans that conflict was unavoidable. By portraying the invasion as a defensive measure, the regime sought to rally public support and justify the immense sacrifices that war would demand. Soldiers were told they were preventing a future invasion of their homeland, framing the campaign as an act of survival rather than conquest. The language of fear and urgency shaped morale and expectations across society. Within the military, preparations for a preemptive strike accelerated as German forces achieved victories elsewhere in Europe. Generals were instructed to develop plans for a lightning campaign that would cripple Soviet command structures and prevent organized resistance. Intelligence officers studied maps, railways, and troop deployments, searching for weaknesses that could be exploited in the opening weeks. The belief that the Soviet Union posed a growing threat encouraged aggressive planning. and a willingness to take risks that might have seemed unacceptable under different circumstances. Operational discussions often centered on how quickly German armies could advance before Soviet forces regrouped, amplified these fears. He believed that ideological enemies would eventually attack Germany regardless of treaties or diplomacy. Reports of Soviet industrial expansion were interpreted through this lens, reinforcing his conviction that time was not on Germany's side. Even intelligence, suggesting that the Soviet Union was unprepared for immediate war, was often dismissed or reinterpreted as deception. The fear of being caught off guard overshadowed cautious analysis, pushing leaders toward decisive action. Advisors who urged patience sometimes struggled to counter the momentum created by ideological suspicion and strategic anxiety. As PA, reparations continued. Diplomatic relations between the two nations became increasingly tense. Trade agreements and negotiations masked deeper mistrust, while border incidents and intelligence rumors heightened the sense that conflict was inevitable. Military units quietly moved toward the frontier, and supply depots were stocked in anticipation of rapid mobilization. Soldiers trained for operations that emphasized speed and surprise, reflecting the belief that striking first would provide a crucial advantage. The atmosphere of secrecy and urgency created a sense that history was accelerating toward an unavoidable confrontation. When the invasion began, German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory, believing they were preventing a future threat. Many had been convinced that Soviet forces were preparing their own attack and that preemption was essential to survival. Early successes seemed to validate this belief, as large numbers of Soviet troops were captured and vast territories fell under German control. Propaganda celebrated these victories as proof that Germany had acted just in time to neutralize a dangerous adversary. However, as resistance stiffened and the war dragged on, the narrative of an easy defensive campaign became increasingly difficult to sustain. The preemptive logic also influenced how German commanders approached the campaign. Rapid advances were prioritized to prevent Soviet reorganization, leading to deep penetrations into hostile territory. Supply lines stretched thin as armies raced forward, determined to maintain momentum before Soviet industry and manpower could fully mobilize. Strategic decisions often reflected fear of giving the enemy time to recover, resulting in relentless offensives. Even when conditions were unfavorable, soldiers experienced intense pressure to push onward, driven by the belief that slowing down would allow a powerful opponent to regroup. On the Soviet side, the invasion shattered assumptions that diplomacy could prevent war and triggered a massive mobilization effort. Factories were relocated eastward, armies regrouped, and civilians were called upon to defend their homeland against what they now saw as an existential threat. The clash between preemptive fears and defensive resolve transformed the Eastern Front into a brutal struggle marked by immense casualties and widespread destruction. Each side believed it was fighting for survival, intensifying the ferocity of combat and the scale of suffering experienced by soldiers and civilians alike. As months passed, the initial confidence in a quick victory faded. German forces encountered vast distances, harsh weather, and determined resistance that challenged the assumption that a preemptive strike would secure an easy triumph. Intelligence failures and logistical problems undermined operational plans, while Soviet industry proved capable of sustaining prolonged warfare despite early setbacks. Yet Hitler remained convinced that his decision to attack first had been necessary, interpreting setbacks as evidence that the enemy had indeed been formidable and dangerous. Speeches and orders continued to emphasize the importance of maintaining pressure to prevent a Soviet resurgence. The narrative of preemptive defense shaped daily life on the front lines. Political officers reminded troops that retreat or hesitation could invite disaster, reinforcing a mindset of constant aggression. Letters home described a war portrayed as unavoidable, with soldiers convinced they were protecting their families from a looming threat. Military planners resawed this as strategies to maintain offensive momentum, often pushing exhausted units into new battles to prevent the enemy from regrouping. Convoys moved relentlessly along muddy roads, carrying ammunition and fuel to support continuous advances. Behind the lines, administrators managed occupied territories with the expectation that Soviet forces would attempt counterattacks at any moment. Defensive fortifications were constructed, even as offensive operations continued, reflecting a deep-seated fear of sudden reversal. Intelligence units monitored Soviet troop movements obsessively, searching for signs of a large-scale offensive that might confirm earlier fears. Reports of new Soviet divisions fueled renewed urgency, reinforcing the belief that the invasion had been a necessary precaution rather than a reckless gamble. The fear-driven strategy influenced decisions at every level of command, from high-ranking generals to junior officers tasked with holding remote outposts. Patrols moved cautiously through forests and villages, wary of ambushes and partisan attacks that reinforced the perception of constant danger. Soldiers endured long nights, listening for distant artillery, convinced that the enemy was always preparing a counterstrike. Engineers rushed to repair bridges and railways to maintain mobility, while reconnaissance aircraft scanned vast landscapes for signs of Soviet concentration. Throughout the campaign, the idea of preemptive war remained embedded in speeches, orders, and propaganda, shaping how events were interpreted regardless of changing circumstances. Columns advancing across plains under the conviction that delay could invite catastrophe, commanders debating whether to pause for resupply or push forward to deny the enemy time to reorganize. Intelligence officers compiling reports that highlighted potential threats more than opportunities for diplomacy, soldiers digging trenches while awaiting orders for the next offensive, trains unloading reinforcements at forward depots amid rumors of massive Soviet buildups beyond the horizon, political briefings emphasizing vigilance against an enemy portrayed as relentless and cunning, armored units maneuvering through villages with the expectation of sudden counterattack at any moment, field radios crackling with warnings of possible enemy breakthroughs that demanded immediate response, maps covered with arrows indicating rapid advances, meant to keep pressure on opposing forces, columns of infantry marching through endless fields, believing each kilometer gained pushed danger farther from their homeland, officers reminding exhausted troops that hesitation could allow the enemy to regroup, supply convoys racing against time to deliver fuel before the next offensive began. Sentries scanning dark forests for movement that might signal an impending assault, reconnaissance patrols reporting distant troop movements that fueled renewed urgency across command posts, the relentless push forward driven by fear of what might happen if momentum were lost, as preemptive logic continued to guide strategy decisions, and the daily experiences of soldiers moving deeper into territory defined by suspicion, anticipation, and the constant belief that survival depended on striking before being struck. Overconfidence, born from early military triumphs, played a decisive role in convincing Adolf Hitler. Decisive campaign against the Soviet Union would be both possible and inevitable. Victories across Western Europe had created an aura of invincibility around the German armed forces, fostering a belief that modern tactics, armored divisions, and coordinated air power could overwhelm any opponent within weeks. Commanders pointed to the swift collapse of Poland, the stunning defeat of France, and the rapid advances through the Low Countries as evidence that German strategy had redefined warfare itself. These experiences convinced many leaders that the same formula could be applied in the East, leading to expectations that the Soviet Union would crumble before it could fully mobilize its vast resources and manpower. The culture within the German high command became increasingly shaped by success. Generals who had participated in lightning campaigns grew confident in their operational methods, while Hitler's personal belief in his own strategic genius deepened after each victory. Planning meetings for the Eastern invasion often reflected an assumption that the war would be short, with discussions focused on post-victory occupation rather than prolonged resistance. Intelligence assessments that warned of Soviet industrial capacity and geographic depth were sometimes dismissed as overly cautious. The idea that German forces possessed an unstoppable momentum became a guiding principle, influencing both strategic planning and troop morale. Propaganda reinforced this sense of superiority among soldiers and civilians alike. Newspapers and newsreels celebrated rapid advances and dramatic encirclements, portraying German forces as technologically advanced and tactically brilliant. Recruits entering the army carried expectations shaped by these narratives, believing they were part of a military machine that had already proven its dominance over Europe. Training emphasized speed and aggression, encouraging soldiers to aimed relentless pressure on enemy forces. The promise of a quick victory influenced logistical planning as well, with supply chains designed for fast-moving offensives rather than extended campaigns across vast territories. As preparations for the invasion intensified, operational plans were built around ambitious timelines. Commanders expected Soviet defenses to collapse under the shock of coordinated assaults, allowing German armies to capture key cities and strategic objectives before winter. Maps displayed bold arrows sweeping across enormous distances, reflecting confidence that armored units could advance hundreds of kilometers within weeks. Logistics officers calculated fuel and ammunition needs based on rapid movement, rather than prolonged sieges or defensive warfare. The assumption of quick success shaped everything from troop deployments to diplomatic expectations about the broader course of the war. When the invasion began, early successes seemed to confirm these optimistic predictions. Large numbers of Soviet troops were captured in massive encirclements, and German forces advanced deep into enemy territory at astonishing speed. Reports from the front described abandoned equipment, disorganized retreats, and the apparent collapse of Soviet command structures. Soldiers wrote letters home, expressing confidence that victory was near, echoing the belief that the campaign would be over before winter. High-ranking officials celebrated initial gains as proof that their strategy was sound, reinforcing the conviction that Germany's military prowess was unmatched. However, the deeper German forces advanced, the more the limitations of overconfidence began to emerge. The vastness of Soviet territory stretched supply lines to the breaking point, while unexpected resistance slowed progress. Harsh weather conditions, unfamiliar terrain, and logistical challenges revealed that the campaign would be far more complex than earlier wars in Western Europe. Soviet industry began relocating eastward, preserving production capacity that German planners had expected to destroy quickly. Reinforcements continued to appear on the battlefield, challenging the assumption that the enemy was on the brink of collapse. Despite mounting difficulties, Hitler and many commanders clung to their belief in ultimate victory. Orders emphasized continued offensive action, even when units were exhausted or undersupplied. The expectation that a decisive breakthrough was always just around the corner encouraged risky maneuvers and deep advances that exposed flanks and stretched resources thin. Intelligence warnings about the scale of Soviet reserves were often minimized, as overconfidence made it difficult for leaders to accept that the enemy might recover from early setbacks. Strategic decisions increasingly reflected optimism rather than caution. The overestimation of German capabilities also influenced interactions between political leaders and military professionals. Officers who suggested slowing down or consolidating gains sometimes faced criticism for lacking faith in the army's strength. Hitler's direct involvement in operational decisions intensified this dynamic, as his confidence in rapid victory overrode concerns raised by experienced commanders. Plans continued to prioritize ambitious objectives, such as capturing major cities and industrial regions, simultaneously rather than focusing on achievable limited goals. The pressure to maintain momentum led to relentless offensives that exhausted troops and depleted equipment. On the front lines, soldiers experienced the consequences of overconfidence firsthand. Units that had expected swift triumph found themselves engaged in prolonged battles against determined defenders. Supply shortages became common as convoys struggled to keep pace with advancing divisions. Harsh winters caught many troops unprepared, exposing weaknesses in planning that had assumed the campaign would end before severe weather arrived. Morale began to shift as the reality of attrition replaced the optimism of early victories. Yet propaganda continued to emphasize success, creating a gap between official narratives and the daily experiences of soldiers facing relentless resistance. As the war dragged on, the initial belief in invincibility gave way to a struggle for survival across an immense and hostile landscape. German forces faced counteroffensives that demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of the Soviet military. The assumption that technological superiority alone could guarantee victory proved flawed in the face of vast manpower reserves and relentless industrial production. Commanders were forced to adapt to defensive operations, even as leadership insisted on continued offensives. The contrast between early expectations and harsh reality became increasingly apparent in reports from the field. Despite these challenges, the culture of overconfidence continued to influence decisions well into the later stages of the campaign. New offensives were launched in hopes of achieving the decisive victory that had been predicted from the start. Political speeches framed setbacks as temporary and insisted that ultimate triumph remained certain. Soldiers were encouraged to believe that perseverance would eventually bring the swift victory they had been promised, even as the war turned into a prolonged and devastating struggle. The legacy of early success shaped the mindset of both leaders and soldiers throughout the Eastern Campaign, armored columns pushing forward across endless plains, under orders that assumed the enemy was nearing collapse. Commanders studying maps filled with optimistic projections of rapid advances toward distant objectives, convoys racing to keep up with spearhead units moving faster than supply lines could sustain, officers briefing troops on expectations of quick encirclements, while intelligence reports warned of growing resistance. Divisions advancing into unfamiliar terrain with confidence, forged in earlier victories that had unfolded on smaller battlefields, field radios crackling with orders to maintain momentum despite rising casualties and mechanical failures, soldiers writing home about anticipated triumphs, even as they faced mounting logistical challenges, engineers struggling to repair roads and bridges damaged by retreating forces, determined to slow the advance, reconnaissance patrols reporting fresh enemy formations that contradicted assumptions of imminent collapse, winter approaching as units realized the campaign would not end as quickly as promised, commanders debating whether to pause or push forward in pursuit of decisive breakthroughs that never fully materialized, columns of infantry marching through snow and mud under the weight of expectations shaped by past triumphs, artillery units repositioning constantly, TO support offensives launched with the belief that one final push could secure victory, planners revising tables again and again while maintaining faith in strategies rooted in earlier success. soldiers clinging to the conviction that their army's reputation for speed and power would ultimately prevail as they advanced deeper into a war defined by distance, resistance, and the consequences of overconfidence that continued to shape every decision and every step forward across the vast Eastern Front. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.